I'm going to share the screen. So, I hope you can see the screen. And welcome to the session Exchange Server and Teams Integration. My name is Ralf Leistner. I'm working for Microsoft from out of Munich.
Munich, Germany this time.
Yeah. Munich, Germany, correct. The time here is 10 p.m. now. And as you can see, later this week we will have the Oktoberfest starting. So I already adjusted the background a bit to get the first link to the upcoming event. So we want to talk about Teams and the Exchange integration, and this would be the agenda. This is mostly about Teams and Exchange on-premises integration. Of course, for the Exchange Online part, which I will also cover a bit or partially, we in Office 365, of course, make sure that everything works smooth and fine, 24/7. But the trick here, the on-premise part is, and the bigger the on-premise part is, more issues can happen. So this will basically the more important or the more interesting, and of course also the bigger part. I would like to go through to the architecture and requirements if you want to have Teams integration with Exchange on-premises. I'll quickly cover Autodiscover version 2 for those who are not aware of how it works and what principles there are in Autodiscover v2, which is kind of the new version of the old Autodiscover.xml part, which probably most of you know from the Outlook and Exchange context. And then we will go through the three main integration portions, which is the Teams calendar app that populates with data from the Exchange calendar or the mailbox calendar. Then we have the topic meeting planning for delegates. And then kind of interesting team part is the REST API and the present status in Teams based on calendar data. And then a small portion of how is this all related to the user photo or user pictures challenges that happen in hybrid environments, especially or limited in this case to Teams and Exchange mailboxes. So those are the three main pillars. It's the calendar app data, it's the delegate meeting planning scenario, and then finally we have the present status and contact card scenario, contact card in Teams. If you hover over a user picture or user photo, you can see a contact card, and this contact card is also partially populated using a REST API data coming from the Exchange on-premises mailbox. And those three scenarios or those three technologies, they all rely on Autodiscover v2. And that's why we want to cover this in the first place to get a basic understanding how that works and what potentially could go wrong in Autodiscover. First of all, however, I would like to go through the architectural requirements or the architectural layout, which is especially if you think about the old days of Skype for Business, which is very different to what it was in Skype for Business in the past. As you can see on the left side, Lower side, there is a Teams client. This can be the Teams Windows desktop client, or it can be the Mac client, or it can be a mobile phone or smartphone, or even the Teams web app client. Doesn't really matter. The most important thing to understand is that the Teams client only communicates with a Teams backend infrastructure that runs in M365, basically. And Teams never, or the Teams client never connects actually to the mailbox, which can be located either in Exchange Online or in Exchange On-Prem, which is the lower right part. As mentioned earlier, everything relies on auto-discover. So the blue arrows represent the auto-discover part, and the red arrows represent the REST API or Exchange Web Services part. So how does, also what are the requirements to interact Teams with Exchange Server, which means on-premises in that case? Of course, none of this is needed if you're on a pure Exchange Online or a pure tenant configuration. But these are the requirements or the technologies used when you still use Exchange on-premises mailboxes. Of course, we need to have Exchange Server. In this case, 2016 or higher. We can. Oops. Sorry. We can basically ignore Exchange 2013 because it's soon to be end of life. And as in all hybrid deployments with Exchange, we need customers or need you to be on the latest cumulative update for Exchange to be in a supported state. Then, of course, we need Azure AD Connect to sync the identities from the on-premises AD to Azure AD, and Azure AD then syncs them forward into the Exchange Online tenant and into Teams. Then, of course, you need assigned licenses to the users who should supposed to use Teams. We require OAuth to be configured between M365 and the Exchange on-premises infrastructure. And therefore, the most obvious way to do this is using the hybrid configuration wizard for Exchange, also known as HCW. But it can also be done or achieved by doing all this manual. And you can find using a search engine of your choice to how to manual configure OAuth between Azure AD and Exchange on-prem. If you use the hybrid configuration wizard, it's crucial to select the classic hybrid mode and not the modern hybrid agent hybrids scenario. That's not yet supported with this Teams integration, and we rely on OAuth and direct connection between Teams and the Exchange server. So the agent of the modern hybrid cannot be used. Additionally, as for an Exchange classic hybrid as a standard, we require you to publish Exchange Web Services and auto-discover to at least into the direction of M365 or Office 365. Additionally, for the Teams integration, we also require you to publish the REST API virtual directory, as this is only used by Teams. Then, and the next step is also achieved or can be achieved by the hybrid configuration wizard, is the EWS namespace, which is identical to the REST API namespace. needs to be configured in Azure AD as a service connection point or service principal name, sorry, in order to make Outlook for Mac working in this scenario. And the last step would be to configure the Sky for Business partner application. Yeah, it's still called Sky for Business partner application, but it needs to be configured in the on-premises Active Directory and Exchange infrastructure for the delegate scenario. And on the bottom, you can find a link how to manual configure the OAuth between Azure AD and Exchange on-premises. So let's talk about Auto-Discover. So Teams, in that case, not the Teams client, but the Teams backend infrastructure uses Auto-Discover in order to identify what type of mailbox the request is for. Is it an Exchange Online mailbox or is it a on-premises hosted mailbox? And therefore, Auto-Discover is used to retrieve the EWS and the REST endpoint namespaces or URLs or however you want to call it. And therefore, Teams uses Auto-Discover version 2, which is a anonymous JSON request sent to any of your Exchange on-prem server. And then the request gets proxied to the recording associated backend server where the mailbox is located, and then a URL comes back to the Teams backend server. How the process works in detail is, as mentioned earlier, Teams always goes to Exchange Online first, sends the Auto-Discover v2 JSON request to Exchange Online, and then Exchange Online checks the recipient type where the email address is for. So is it a mailbox in Exchange Online? Then it will return the outlook.office365 /EWS/Exchange ASMX namespace. However, if the email address in the Auto-Discover v2 response or request is a mail user, then it will redirect the Teams server to either a SRV record, which is configured in your DNS, or to the standard autodiscover.contoso.com namespace. And then Teams sends the JSON request to the on-premises endpoint, and in order to retrieve the EWS namespace or REST namespace in that case. So this is how it works. And we'll have a brief look in a moment how this actually can be tested. How to troubleshoot Auto-Discover issues. Since the Teams client doesn't do any Auto-Discover, it's all done by the backend servers. It's useless to trace on the Teams client using Fiddler or using the Teams logs. However, you can easily test it yourself, because Auto-Discover v2 requests are always anonymous and don't require any authentication. You can also easily run it from a PowerShell or directly in the web browser using the URLs on the screen. And if something goes wrong, you can collect a Fiddler trace on, for instance, on the machine you're running the PowerShell or the web browser test. And in that Fiddler trace, you can see maybe what's going wrong. We'll have a look into this in a moment. Let me bring up the lab environment. So this is a PowerShell window I hope the font size is big enough. And you can run this PowerShell commandlet, and so invoke REST method, sorry, to that URL. And in this case, it's for one of my users in my test lab, which is delegate@contosaexchange.com. You can see it takes a while, which means that there probably is something going wrong. If you want to see what's going wrong, you can start a fiddler in the background, start tracing in fiddler. Let's do this again. Oh, it's still running. Let me run this again. So this was timing out. And in here you can see that what I mentioned earlier, that the request goes to Exchange Online, and then Exchange Online comes back with this HTTP 302 redirect, redirecting the PowerShell Autodiscover v2 client in this case to the on-premises namespace, which is autodiscover.emaildomain.com in this case. And then the PowerShell commandlet will go to try to establish a connection to the on-premises endpoint. So in this case, it's timing out because there's a firewall rule in place. Let me quickly open up the firewall. And then we can do this again. And now you can see it's immediately working and returning the EWS namespace from the on-premises endpoint. And you can simply modify this by changing the protocol to REST maybe, and then you will receive the REST API endpoint. And this corresponds to, of course, the fiddler trace. This is the redirect again. And then we're doing a tunnel to the on-premises endpoint. Well, there's Outlook running in the background. This is the TLS handshake, and then there should be another autodiscover request. Can't find it right now. Which actually the Exchange server provides the, here it is, the EWS namespace. All right, let's move on in the slide deck. So what else can you do? You can use the Microsoft Remote Connectivity Analyzer. There's also a autodiscover check if you prefer to use that one. It doesn't provide as many details as you can see in the fiddler trace. If something goes wrong, you can of course check the autodiscover logs on your Exchange on-premises server. Check the IIS logs for Teams requests, and if nothing is in there, you might need to do a network trace on your on-premises Exchange server and check for TLS handshake errors or maybe something wrong with the certificate you're using, and so on, something like that. If you want to look in the autodiscover logs, for instance, let me quickly share an overview on the relevant log files on the Exchange on-premises part. You know, there's a lot of logging going on there. When the Teams request comes in, it hits the IIS first, and then we are hitting the Exchange services app pool. in that case for EWS, but it's the same for Autodiscover as well. And this is also the most important log file you want to look in, because this is where, in case of OAuth, the authentication happens. And you can easily check for 401s, maybe if OAuth is not working properly. And these log files can be found in the Exchange installation folder under logging, HTTP proxy, and then EWS. Once the authentication works and succeeds, then the request gets proxied to the Exchange mailbox component. And again, IIS log, and again, HTTP error log in case something goes wrong. And the most important log file on the backend is as well the EWS log, for instance, which can be found in the logging folder underneath your Exchange installation path. All right, so this is a brief recap of the logging folders and files which are relevant. So let's now dive into the Teams calendar app part. As mentioned earlier, Teams uses Exchange Web Services to retrieve calendar data. And a reminder, Teams does not directly connect to Exchange. So it works the same way as Autodiscover works. Teams does the Autodiscover v2 request first. Then, as we just saw, the EWS endpoint comes back. And finally, Exchange or the Teams backend server tries to connect to the Exchange on-prem server to the EWS folder or EWS endpoint, and authenticates using an OAuth token issued by Azure AD. Exchange has to accept or should accept the token if everything works fine. Then the Teams client or Teams backend server sends an EWS SOAP request to get the calendar items from EWS. And then Exchange returns the calendar data, and the Teams middle tier servers populate the app, so the user's front end, using all that calendar data that gets retrieved by the SOAP requests. So this is how it works. And the most complicated thing in that case is the authentication, of course. But first of all, we can check if the URL that has been provided by the Exchange server for the EWS endpoint is reachable, has public DNS entries, is reachable from external. You can use a browser to try to access the EWS endpoint. Again, a timeout, as we just saw before, does not necessarily indicate a problem, because many customers limit the access to EWS, to Autodiscover, to REST endpoints, to the Office 365 IP ranges. In that case, you can't use your client to test it, and you're getting a timeout. Then you can use the Exchange Remote Connectivity Analyzer. There is a test scenario for the Teams calendar app. You can use that one. And if it doesn't work, quite often the state in the Remote Connectivity Analyzer tool says undiscoverable. So undiscoverable might indicate that there's something wrong using the Autodiscover process, which is not necessarily the case. So undiscoverable in Teams backend also means that something with the OAuth authentication could have gone wrong. It doesn't necessarily indicate an Autodiscover issue. So to verify that OAuth works correctly, you can use the test OAuth connectivity commandlets, which are provided by Exchange Online or Exchange On-Premises PowerShell. And as just mentioned, we can use the EWS HTTP proxy logs and query them for OAuth errors. So for 401s in the HTTP proxy logs for OAuth. If you use a browser to access the EWS endpoint, you can also use Fiddler in the background and see if OAuth is enabled and what front end server you're hitting as indicating on the screenshot below or on the right side. So additionally, for all EWS requests, they could be limited to specific user agent in Exchange Server or Exchange On-Premises. We call them EWS allow and block lists. They can either be set on the organization level or on the mailbox level, so per user. Not very often in use, but some customers use them. And if you want to use teams in that environment, you have to whitelist the Teams user agents, which are listed below. So there's different user agents from different team backend services, like the calendar service, the delegate scenario using the scheduling service, the present service for the present status updates, and for auto-discover, there is another user agent called Skype Spaces. To troubleshoot user agent or EWS block and allow list issues, you can also go and use the EWS proxy logs. From time to time, I'm using Log Parser Studio, and on the lower right side, you can see a sample query from Log Parser Studio for the calendar service. You can filter by the user agent and then HTTP status 500. And you can also modify this and check for OAuth issues using HTTP status 401 in that case. And this, of course, applies also to all the user scenario, as including the Teams delegate scenario. So what's the Teams delegate scenario then finally all about? The delegate scenario means a given mailbox has configured a delegate, so kind of manager secretary scenario. And the delegate, in that case, tries to create a meeting, a Teams meeting in the calendar of the manager or delegator, however you want to call it. And in that case, and not for the own calendar, only in the delegate, so in a remote calendar, can also be a shared mailbox, for instance, if you want to create team meetings in shared mailboxes or something like that. This is covered in the Teams delegate meeting scenario. So how it works, the delegate navigates to the manager's calendar, hits the button for a new Teams meeting in Outlook. In Outlook, there's this, Teams meeting add-in. I can show you in a second. And the Teams meeting add-in in Outlook, it connects to Teams middle tier, in this case, the scheduling service. And then the scheduling service again does an auto-discover v2 request to get the EWS URL. It connects and authenticates to the EWS endpoint, again using OAuth Bureau token. And then, and that's the difference to the other calendar call, the team scheduling service backend server sends a get delegate SOAP request for the manager's mailbox, so for the delegator's mailbox, to the Exchange on-premises server, and Exchange on-premises returns then a list of delegates configured for this specific mailbox. And once this succeeds and the delegate is on that list, then Teams scheduling service provides the meeting details, or the URL, dial-in numbers, and whatever you have to Outlook and into the new meeting. So how to troubleshoot this? Yeah, in general, there is two different error messages you can get in Outlook when, in this case, it's Outlook for Windows. When something goes wrong in the mentioned process, the first and the upper one on the right side indicates that there's a permission issue for this account, and you should go and ask the owner or the delegator in this case to get the proper permissions and then try it again. The second error message indicates that there is a general connectivity issue to the Exchange on-premises server. So what do we do to find out what's going wrong? Of course, we can check if the calendar apps works correctly. So that rules out any kind of OAuth configuration issue, any kind of auto-discover issue. But keep in mind that the delegate, the scheduling service is using a different user agent than the calendar service. We can use a tool called SOAPy to manually send a get delegate SOAP request to the mailbox and check the answer or the response coming from Exchange. And the most important thing and the most frequent issue is the permission issue, so the upper error message. So for that, you have to keep in mind that adding calendar permissions is not sufficient for this to succeed. Because if you do just add calendar permissions, the delegate is not actually on the delegation list that is stored in the manager's mailbox. In order to have the delegate on this list, you have to use the Outlook delegation wizard, which is triggered in Outlook directly. So can't be done in OWA, or for EXO mailboxes, you can run the add mailbox folder permission commandlet, but you have to add this sharing permissions flags delegate parameter to it to have the delegate added to that list. If this is ruled out, you can check if the get delegate call is succeeding. It's hitting Exchange. It's going to the right backend mailbox server. And if it's a status 200, so if it works fine. If that's not the case and you're still getting a 500 maybe, or a 401, you can check the partner application configuration and then go through the same logs as mentioned before. So in this case, it's all EWS. So let me quickly share how this SOAPy tool looks like in the lab environment. Quickly close the fiddler here, minimize this body. The SOAPy tool can be found on GitHub. You can download it and just launch it on a client. And it comes with a wide range of SOAP requests that can be used. for instance, find folder or get attachment, and also get delegate. And this is the relevant SOAP request. You just load it into the tool, add the manager's email address, and then run it. In this case, it's an Office 365 mailbox, but you can also customize it and run it against an on-premises server. You're kind of sending this out, and Exchange returns this XML response, which is the delegate user response message. And it includes a list of delegated users for this mailbox, which we put in here, which is in my case, it's Bono at composerexchange.com. And the list of delegates now here includes the SMTP address of the delegate, as well as the SID of this delegate and the folder permissions. In this case, the delegate has editor permissions on the calendar folder only. But that's sufficient in order to be able to create like a new Teams meeting in a different calendar. So click on New Teams Meeting, and then it takes a while in order to get the meeting created, to run all this SOAP requests in the background. And once it's succeeded, then the meeting add-in in Outlook then provides this part of the meeting request, including meeting ID, links to download, links to join, and if you have, it also includes dial-in data. So that's the reason why it takes a couple of seconds to get this meeting populated. All right. Let's press on a bit. And coming to the last scenario, which is all related to the REST API. So as of today, September 2022, as mentioned earlier, the Teams presence service is running in Office 365, and that provides the presence information to the Teams client based on calendar data, requires us to use REST API and the /API virtual directory on the Exchange side in order to retrieve the same calendar data basically as the calendar app. But in this case, it only calculates the presence information. And furthermore, the REST API is in use to populate the contact card or a specific component of the contact card in Teams, in the Teams client. And that's the time zone. As the time zone for a mailbox is stored in the mailbox as well. Teams connects to REST API in order to retrieve the time zone where a given mailbox is configured to, or where the user is in. And then it calculates based on the time zone given from the mailbox. It calculates the difference to your time zone in the Teams client. For the presence information, there is two modes. One mode is the pull mode. So let's say Teams scheduling service connects to the mailbox every hour, every 60 minutes, and tries to retrieve the recent calendar information or the recent meetings. And then there is the push mode, where Teams scheduling service tries to create a push subscription. However, this only works in Exchange Online, as the EWS subscription is not implemented in Exchange on premises. So that means for on-prem mailboxes, new calendar data is only retrieved each 60 minutes. How it works? So similar to the other two scenarios, again, and as mentioned earlier, we are using Auto-Discovery 2 to retrieve the REST API endpoint. Then Teams scheduling service in this case connects to the /API virtual directory using a bureau token to authenticate. It tries to create the subscription, which is not implemented in Exchange on-prem. That's going to fail for the on-prem mailbox, and you can see many RPC endpoint not found error messages in the REST logs on an on-prem server. However, the pull mode works, and then it sends back the calendar data that have been requested, let's say, for the upcoming 24 hours. The Teams client itself connects to the presence service every 6 minutes in order to get the presence the current presence information or presence status. And in case there's any change, or it might take some time to be reflected in the presence status on the Teams client side. This also means for on-premises mailboxes, if a meeting is canceled right before it should start, or if you have a new meeting, let's say 20 minutes prior it starts, your presence status might be incorrect as the pull mode only runs every 60 minutes. To come around this limitation, and as you might have probably heard that the REST API gets removed, and is deprecated, gets removed from the service, so Office 365. And it also has an end of life for Exchange on-premises very soon. So I think, if I remember correctly, in November this year, the REST API will be removed from Office 365. And is now no longer supported in Exchange on-prem as well. This means that in the near future, Teams presence service will transition to EWS for on-prem mailboxes, which is good news, as EWS also supports subscriptions, and the time or the presence status in the Teams client will be more accurate in that case. On the right side, you can see the contact card or part of the contact card and the time zone part. And this time zone part also relies on REST API, and it will be removed from the Exchange, not from the Exchange, from the Teams user interface shortly. Or it might have been already removed, depending on what deployment ring you are. So do we have some minutes left? Yeah. So last topic, which doesn't really belong to Teams or Exchange, but is quite frequently asked. So how does this profile picture thing work in a hybrid desynced environment with Teams or limited to Teams and Exchange on-prem? Works as follows. So if your mailbox is on premises, the user or the admin can upload a so-called high resolution picture, which is not really high resolution, but it's 648 by 648 maximum. And the user can upload this into the on-premises mailbox. And the admin can use add user photos, commandlet to upload it into the user's mailbox as well. Once this is done, a smaller version of the same picture will be created and stored into the on-premises AD. And in the user's thumbnail attribute, or in the thumbnail attribute of the user. And this is a pretty tiny picture, 96 pixels. And this thumbnail picture also gets synced into Azure AD at least once during the initial sync of the user. If you change the picture later on in on-premises, we'll come to that later. It will no more updated in Azure AD, so it will only be synced once. Then if you deploy Teams, and your users will notice that they can upload user pictures in Teams as well, and they are stored in M365. So that means that, and this is quite frequently asked on our end, that means that you can have, or you will end up having, different user pictures in Teams client and in Outlook, for instance, or in Windows, depending on where Windows is joined to the on-prem AD or to the Azure AD. And this is quite confusing to many customers. So I kind of would like to have this been clarified, that Teams does not leverage the user photo that is stored in the on-premises mailbox, for instance. So, however, if you upload a picture in Teams, it gets stored. Gets uploaded to Office 365, but where is it actually stored? And if anyone knows the answer where it's actually stored, can come off mute and provide the answer. Because there is not many obvious places in Office 365 where it could be stored, right? If nobody knows, I can provide the answer as well. So if you upload pardon?
Is it an Exchange?
Yeah, it is an Exchange. In Exchange Online. However, it's stored in a so-called shard mailbox that you cannot see in the, for instance, Exchange Online PowerShell, because the user is there, it's a mail user and doesn't actually have a mailbox. But in the background, it actually has a mailbox, a so-called shard mailbox, and this is where the picture is actually stored. All right, so coming to the end, if there's any questions left. I honestly don't see the Teams chat, but maybe you can come off mute if there's any question left or anything unanswered. If
Is
not,
there any plans to change how Teams process delegates? Like, I mean, you explain the current state, then you ask for get delegates, but why don't you ask for get mailbox permissions, for example?
sorry,
It's like it's a very weird situation when people having full access to the mailbox, to all mailbox objects, including calendar, and those people still cannot create Teams only meetings. So any other meetings are just fine. But not
correct,
Teams.
Correct, yeah.
Why
any other meetings are just fine, but not Teams. Yeah, you are right. And I don't know if there's any plans to change this, to be honest. From the Teams engineering side. As of now, I'm not aware of any plans, but maybe in the future they change it away from EWS and just try to find out the mailbox folder permissions on a different way, but as of today and in the near future, there is no plans to change this. But yeah, I agree. It makes things complicated. And I also agree that some of our public documentation is not reflecting this correctly as of now, because they are talking about the mailbox folder permissions, and then you should add send as permissions and stuff like that, which is not quite right.
Ralf, just a heads up that we are at time.
Thank you. If there is no further question, then we can.
Sorry, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Can we integrate Teams with Exchange 2013 AWS?
With Exchange 2013?
Yeah.
No, in Exchange 2013, only the delegates scenario works.
Okay.
Any other scenario is hard blocked by the Teams backend infrastructure. So if the Exchange version comes back with something like 50.0 or something, which is Exchange 2013, they immediately block this request and don't move on. So it's a hard block coded into the Teams
Okay, got it.
calendar
Thanks.
service or Teams scheduling service, whatever. But yeah, Exchange 2013 is also going end of life within roughly 6 months from now on. So there won't be any changes anymore. I think it's April 23 where the extended support ends for Exchange 2013. All right, thank you very much. And for joining.